All right, and go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Bill. I appreciate the invitation for today. Talking about one of my favorite things is birding. I used to teach a class in ornithology, which is the study of birds. So I always appreciate birds and what you can do to manage birds in your property, be it in urban areas, forested land, or whatever the case might be. But as the title slide says, my name is David Drake, and I'm a extension wildlife specialist and a professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then I'm also part of the University of Wisconsin Extension, or University of Wisconsin's Extension. So what I'd like to do today is just give you some considerations to think about in ways you might be able to manage your forest land to benefit birds. And I want to give you an overview of the avian world here in Wisconsin, and then focus on habitat issues. And then we're going to talk about some possible things that you might want to think about or consider as you think about how to manage your forest land. And again, I want to just specifically say that you really can't do anything wrong. A lot of times that paralyzes people is when they start thinking about, well, what am I going to do with this property I own or that I manage? You start getting paralyzed because there's so many different choices you can make. And typically, what I tell people is unless you're paving your property over, cutting everything down, paving it over, you really can't make a wrong choice at all. And if it's something that you have started and you want to not do something different, then just change your mind and change your application management and start doing something in a different way. But this should be fun first and foremost, and it is really a privilege to be able to honor, or a privilege to be able to own forest land. So really do something that is meaningful to you and is fun to you. Okay, so just to give you some context for birds in Wisconsin, we have roughly 400 bird species in the state of Wisconsin. About 85% of those birds leave our state in the winter, so they are smart. They're not up here freezing their tail feathers off like we are right now. So about 85% of those birds leave our state. So we've got a minority of those birds that are what we would consider state residents or are here throughout the winter. 56 families of birds. There's one federally endangered species of bird, and that is the piping plover, which is a type of shore nesting bird that you'd find along the shores of Lake Michigan. So if you are in kind of north central Wisconsin, you've got piping plover on your forest land. Either you're doing a really phenomenal job of managing your forest land for shoreline and sand, or that bird is way out of place. So, but one federally endangered species of bird, that is the piping plover. We have 11 state endangered species, and one of those that you see here is that red-shouldered hawk. And then we've got 13 state threatened species. And the one other bird you see in the picture here is a worm-eating warbler. So that's one of the state threatened species as well. Okay, so when it comes to managing wildlife, it doesn't matter if it's birds, mammals, reptiles, or amphibians. And my colleague Jamie Knack's going to talk on Thursday about reptiles and amphibians. It really all comes down to habitat, and habitat is composed of four components. So it's food, water, shelter, and space. So we're going to start with food to begin with. Um, Typically, there's two different ways you can attract animals using food. You can attract them with natural sources of food, or you can track them with human provided sources of food, such as that bird feeders you see up in the upper right-hand corner. For your purposes as forest landowners, really what you're going to be doing is trying to provide natural occurring sources of food or naturally abundant sources of food on your forest land. And that would be, it could be other animals. So that chipmunk, for example, is a very tasty meal for hawks, owls, things like that. But we have granivores, which are seed-eating birds. So you want to have some seed on your property, perhaps. And that could be pine cones. It could be grassland seed, whatever the case might be. We have frugivores, which are fruit-eating birds. So clearly there's a lot of trees that offer fruit. It could be, ash or holly, whatever the case might be like that. We have got insectivores. So a lot of the warblers that come back into our state in the spring and summer, those are the very colorful birds. They are primarily insectivores. So trying to maintain some kind of insect component or community on your property would be very beneficial to the insectivores. And again, typically what happens is all these animals will utilize the food source that's most abundant and is most useful to them in terms of their life history. But there's a period of time when these animals will almost always switch over to insects, whether they're insectivores or not, and that's during the nesting season. So that nesting period is very critical period of these animals' lives. And so when they are nesting, building nests, laying eggs, raising their young, especially when the young have hatched out of those eggs, those young require a lot of insects because those insects are a very good source of protein, and it helps those chicks grow to adults very quickly, so that they can either face the winter that is coming up here if they're resident birds, or they can are strong enough that they can migrate south if they're migratory birds. So if you don't have those, if you don't have a sufficient amount of insects on your property, you're not going to have a lot of nesting birds simply because those insects are such a critical food source during that critical period of life for those birds. So think about not only what food sources these animals or these birds will eat throughout their entire year, but think about what food source they really need during those critical parts of their lifetime in terms of stopover habitat for migration and for nesting periods. We get into water, and obviously up here in the north, especially right now, most of the water is bound up in ice. So that water is inaccessible for our resident bird species during the wintertime. So, to the extent you possibly can, and this is a little bit more difficult when you're owning, especially large tracts of forest land. If you are not lucky enough to have a river that's got some current to it and might stay open most, if not all, of the winter, if you can provide some kind of open source of water in your property, you're going to have the potential to attract a lot more winter birds to your property than maybe your neighbors would if they are not also providing open sources of water. So, the more you can do to provide an open source of water, either if you have a pond on your property, maybe put a bubbler or some kind of an aerator in that pond, if you have the desire to have open water and attract birds to your property. During the summer, again, it's not that big of a deal because typically we're lucky enough to be up in the temperate part of the United States, and we have sufficient water sources available for these birds, especially as you get up into the middle part of the state going north. There's a lot of lakes and things like that these birds have access for water. And most of the birds in our state, if they don't get their, if most of the birds in our state use water in some capacity, so that they actually will drink from an open source of water. There are a minority of species such as, again, insectivores, nectivores, which are birds that are feeding at flowers for nectar, similar to the hummingbird there, and raptor species that are eating other animals. And typically, in insectivores, nectivores, and carnivores, or like the raptors, there's sufficient water in the sources of food that they're eating that usually is enough to hydrate their bodies, that they don't have to go to an open source of water. But for the majority of bird species in our state, they do need some source of water, an external source of water. So the more water you have available in your property, the more potential you have to attract a greater diversity of birds. And then we get into shelter. And so birds need shelter for a whole host of reasons. Right now, the birds that are here in our state are seeking shelter, obviously, to get out of the cold winter wind, to get away from the snow, for example. So evergreens are wonderful things to have in your property in the wintertime, especially because they don't lose their leaves. And those evergreens act like a great big umbrella, nature's umbrella. So birds, as well as many other animals, will seek out those evergreens, so they get some shelter from the wind, get some shelter from the snow. But in the summertime, they need shelter, obviously, from the hot sun, perhaps rain, things like that. They need shelter to nest in. They need shelter to raise their youngs. They need shelter to sleep and things like that. So the more shelter you have on your property, the better. And again, from a forest land standpoint, if you have hardwoods, obviously those hardwoods are not doing a lot to provide either food or shelter to birds in the wintertime because they've lost their leaves and they've lost their the fruit or the food source that they may provide. So if you have some kind of an evergreen component on your property, that will be very, very helpful, especially from a shelter standpoint. All right, and then we're going to talk about space a little bit more in detail as we get into this presentation. But I just want to mention right now, you kind of are stuck with the amount of space you actually have. So if you've got 10 acres, that's great. If you've got 100 acres, that's 10 times better than having 10 acres. But really, the shape of your space is important and can have some impact on birds. And I'll talk more about that in just a few slides. And then also where your property is located is very important in terms of landscape context. So for example, these bottom two pictures here, you'll see that you've got a chunk of forest land in that bottom left picture that's kind of in the middle there, but it's surrounded by open land. It's either some kind of commercial or residential development. There might be some farmland in there, or whatever the case might be. So if that's your forest land in the middle of that, and you're surrounded by non-forest land, your forest land becomes very important in terms of the quantity and quality of the forest land. So the larger that block or island of forest is, and the higher quality it is, the more potential it has to hold birds with up to a certain point. But again, that forest land that you see in the lower left-hand picture there can only hold so many birds because it's only so large. Compared to that forest land on the right side here, where as far as the eye can see, you see just trees. And so if your block of forest land, if you have an acre of forest land, but you're surrounded by forest land as far as you possibly can see, your 1 acre is not going to be as impactful as perhaps your 1 acre in the left-hand corner or left-hand picture would be here, because you're surrounded by so much other forest land. So that regional context can be very, very important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides as well. Okay, now in terms of forest species, in terms of avian species, so we can talk about birds in all sorts of different capacities. We can talk about migratory birds, resident birds, as we've already talked about. We can talk about birds relative to what they eat, again, so such carnivores, frugivores, nectivores, insectivores, things like that. But from a forest standpoint, one way to think about birds is as interior species or as edge species. In interior species, some common examples or representatives of interior species would be this bird in the upper left-hand picture there that's got the spots on his chest and is singing. That's called an ovenbird. And I'm sure that if you haven't seen one, and they are relatively secretive, I'm sure if you've been on your property, you've heard them, even if you don't know that you're hearing an ovenbird. But an ovenbird, the reason they call them ovenbirds is because when they nest on the ground and they build kind of a dome nest that looks similar to a Dutch oven. So that's why they call them ovenbirds. But when they're not nesting, they kind of inhabit the mid canopy of your forest land. And again, they're secretive, but when they call out, and they'll say teacher, 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 teacher. They'll say the word. It sounds like they're saying the word teacher, and it starts off soft and it gets louder, and it starts off kind of slow and it gets more rapid. So it's teacher, 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 and they're very, very loud birds. So again, it's probably unlikely you may not have seen them because they are relatively secretive, but they are very common, and I'm sure you've heard them if you're on your property. The other bird that's somewhat representative of interior forest species is this black and white warbler up there, as you see in the upper right-hand corner. And again, they inhabit kind of the mid canopy. They are also relatively secretive. They blend in really well, especially when there's foliage on the trees because of that black and white feathering that they have there. But they sound kind of like a squeaky wheelbarrow wheel. And again, I'm sure if you just Google black and white warbler song and listen to it, I'm sure you probably will say, yes, I've heard that bird before, but I didn't know what it was. Another example is a Circadian flycatcher. That's the bird right below the black and white warbler. There's a lot of other interior forest species, a lot of other types of warbler species. There are vireos, like red-eyed vireos, for example, and other species that are interior forest species. But I just wanted to use these three as kind of representative. And a lot of people will say, well, what do you mean by interior forest? And it really depends on, again, how much forest land you own and what is around you. So if you are, thinking back to the slide before, if you were that picture where you're 1 acre, but you're surrounded by 1,000 acres of forest land around you, that 1 acre of forest land, it would be interior forest because you're in the middle of 1,000 acres of forest. However, if you've got 10 acres of forest and you're surrounded by nothing but farmland in all the directions you can look, you probably have very little, if any, interior forest to your 10-acre tract because there's just not a lot of interior to that forest land. So interior really depends, and to determine whether or not you've got interior forest, one of the ways to think about that is to look for some of these representative species that would indicate that if they are there, you likely have enough interior forest to your forest tract. that you can sustain these interior species. And then the other part of your forest is an edge part of your forest. So that is kind of an area where perhaps your forest land, maybe you've got an oak forest and is matching up to a pine forest, for example, or you've got a forest and is meeting where that forest meets a shrubland or maybe meets a grassland or something like that. It's that edge of your forest. And at the edge, we're going to talk a little bit more about this as well. But at that edge, you've got different types of birds that inhabit the edge. And so starting with that blue bird there, that's an indigo bunting. The bird that's red with the black wings is a scarlet tanager. And then the bird down here with the bicolored bill and the two white wing bars, that's an eastern wood pewee. And so you'll hear these birds calling the indigo bunting. To me, it sounds a little bit like a kind of a buzzing high voltage wire. The scarlet tanager, a lot of times they'll have a call note and it's chick burr, and so you might hear that in addition to seeing that. The scarlet tanager, that's a male right there. The female is more of a olive green, if you see her. And the eastern wood pewee calls its name, so you'll hear them go pewee, pewee. And I am not doing bird songs the rest of the hour for all these birds, but I just wanted to give you a little sense about what that looks like. So those are some species you might find on the edge, in addition to kingbirds, sparrows, the red-tailed hawks, things like that. Okay, and then we start thinking about the types of forest land you might own and might be managing. And we're going to start off by talking about early and mid-successional forest lands. So early forest lands and mid-successional forest lands. These forest lands have an understory and an overstory, but they don't have much of a mid-canopy or a mid-story at this point, okay? So especially in early forest land, this might be a forest land that's been cut over. Maybe you clear cut it 5 to 10 years ago or something like that, and you've got a lot of shrubby vegetation in there, maybe some grassland coming in as well, and some early trees coming in there. But you have small and medium-sized trees, typically again, depending on the age of that forest land and the type of species on the forest land, maybe there's trees that you can get if you touch your thumb to your thumb and your middle finger to your middle finger, you might be able to get your hand around that size of a tree. And then you've got some shade intolerant plants in there, as well as some shade tolerant saplings and pole trees. So maybe some of the trees you might see that are shade tolerant might be sugar maples, beeches, basswoods, cedars, hemlocks, something like that, depending on where you are in the state. But the types of birds you might see in these early and mid-successional type forest lands, the bird off to the left there is an American redstart. So that's a male American redstart. The one in the middle is a Cooper's hawk. Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks love these types of areas because they've got relatively small trees. Sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks are very acrobatic flyers, so they can zig and zag through those trees that might have a high stem density. Compared to that red-shouldered hawk on one of the first slides, or a red-tailed hawk, they're such large-bodied birds, and their wings just are not dynamic enough to be able to allow them to turn very quickly, like a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk might be. And then another type of bird you might have in there is this tufted titmouse that you see in the right-hand picture. And then we get into mature forests, and again, mature forests, it really is a context specific. It depends on the types of trees you have in their species composition and things like that. But for example, a mature aspen forest might be 50 years old compared to a mature oak forest, which may be 150 years old. So it really depends on the species we're talking about. But in these mature forests, you've got a distinct understory, which is primarily more of a it might be a fern layer, it might be some kind of other flowering plant type layer in there. You have a defined mid canopy, and then you've got a defined understory. And so obviously anything under the understory are all shade tolerant or below canopy species. So again, depending where you are in the state, it could be sugar maple, beech, cedar, hemlock, something like that. But you have very, very large mature trees, and you've got trees that will have a large diameter at breast height. And then you have a lot of snags and down timber, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides as well as to why that's so important. Um, you have mostly shade tolerant below canopy species that we talked about. And then you've got a bunch of different types of birds in these types of forests. So here in the left-hand picture, you might have a black-throated green warbler. And that's a bird, again, that you may not easily see because they inhabit more of the canopy, the upper layer of your forest, but you do hear them, and they're very, very prominent singers. So you'll hear them go z, 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 zoo, z, 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 zoo, z, and you'll, again, likely you've heard these birds, you just may not have seen them. We have a lot of woodpecker species in the state. Here, this one in the middle here is the pileated or pileated woodpecker, depending on how you want to pronounce it. But that bird, if you're walking through your property and you see big chunks of wood at the base of the tree, that is likely from the pileated woodpeckers, because when they hit that tree, they hit it straight and then they turn their head and they just kind of start chiseling big chunks of wood off of that tree. And then you'll have maybe some different types of raptor species. So here's an example of a barred owl that you might have in your woodland. And again, that barred owl, it'll sing like, "Who cooks who cooks for me? Who cooks for you all? Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" That's what the type of song they sing, as opposed to a great horned owl, which is more of a hoot 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 hoot. But you might have screech owls in there. You might have other types of raptor species as well. So those mature forests, also, when you walk inside those mature forests, it might be relatively easy to move through the understory, and it's going to be relatively dark in there compared to the early to mid-successional forest. All right, and we talked about edge. So edge can be really important in a forest land, and edges are really good because they drive biodiversity. So where you have an edge is typically defined as where you've got two or more vegetational communities that come together or that meet. So for example, where you have a forest land meeting a shrubland, or a forest land that meets a grassland, something like that. So that's an example of an edge. But you also may have an edge that's defined based on age of the forest. So if you did a shelterwood cut in your forest, so for example, let's say that you've got primarily a white pine forest, and 15 years ago you cut 30% of that forest off, or harvested 30% of that forest, and 70% is still standing. Well, where that 30% of the forest you cut off and the 70% that you still have standing meet, you have a different age class there. And so that can set up an edge as well. But typically, where you have edges, you have greater species richness or greater biodiversity, because you have multiple types of habitats going on, or that's where multiple types of habitats meet. So the more edge you have, the more species richness you're going to have, up to an extent. But typically, edge really drives biodiversity. So if your goal is to increase the amount of avian diversity, plant diversity, wildlife diversity in general on your property, you want more edge than you want interior, because that edge is going to drive biodiversity, and it's going to allow you for managing for biodiversity. But however, where you have edges, you also have fragmentation. And so if you're trying to increase the amount of interior forest surface you have, or interior forest area you have, you don't want much edge, because that's going to cut into the interior portion of your forest. Where you fragment land, or where you fragment habitat, you are going to increase predation in those areas. And there have been a number of studies that have been done that have looked at nest production within a certain distance of edge compared to nest production in the interior part of the forest. And nest production typically decreases closer to the edge you get, because more and more predators are running that edge, because they know that there's a lot of biodiversity there. There's a good chance that they can actually pick up a meal there. So edge is a good thing, but it possibly does drive predation. The other thing that edge is associated with is, because you're creating an edge, you're also allowing sunlight to actually increase there, compared to a mature forest where sunlight is not able to get to filter down much under the canopy. So where you're driving sunlight more into that edge, you've got more rainwater coming in, more precipitation, and you have disturbance, because you've done something there to create an edge. You've either harvested, or you've developed that area, or whatever the case is. So you have the potential for more invasive non-native species. So you just want to be careful along those edges that you are not promoting more non-native invasive species because of the ability for light to actually penetrate to the ground, precipitation to penetrate to the ground, and you're disturbing the land in some capacity. And typically, those non-native invasive plants can outcompete in many areas our native plant communities. Okay, so species that you might find along the forest edge, we talked a little bit about the indigo bunting and the scarlet tanager, but some other ones, cardinal here. This is a song sparrow in the middle, and this is an eastern kingbird on the right-hand side. An eastern kingbird is in the flycatcher family, so that would be Acadian flycatchers, olive-side flycatcher, um, peewees, phoebes, things like that. Okay, I talked about when we were talking about space, I talked about shape, and the shape of your forest land can have a significant impact on what actually the types of species that you're attracting in terms of birds. So we're going to take everybody back to fifth grade geometry really quick, and we're going to talk about this square on the left-hand side and this ribbon on the right-hand side. And just for argumentative sake, trust me that both the square you see and the ribbon have equal amount of area. Okay, so one's not larger than the other; they're just different shapes. So if you want to have less edge and more interior habitat, you actually want to manage your forest land in squares or in circles, because a square or circle will have less edge compared to the interior part of the area than a ribbon or a linear feature will. If you want to actually manage for more edge and less interior, you want to manage more linearly. You want to have the shape of your forest land or the shape of the tracks you're managing to be more linear, because that linear allows for more edge relative to the interior part of the area. So it really depends on to the extent you can. If you're thinking about harvesting your property, think about do I want to harvest as a circle or a square, or do I want to harvest more linearly? And depending on the shape that you're deciding on, that's going to have an impact based on do you have more biodiversity because you're creating more edge? Do you have perhaps more potential for non-native invasive species to come in because you have more edge? Or do you have less edge and more interior habitat, and therefore you've got the ability to actually attract more interior forest bird species? In terms of patch size, so this really patch size is just it's talking about how much space do you have, or how much of a property, what's the size of your property. Again, as we talked a little bit about, context is very important here. So typically the larger you have, the larger forest land you have, the better. Okay, but again, this is somewhat context dependent, because you are somewhat stuck with the space you have unless you have the ability to buy more land and to continue to add on to the size of forest property you currently own. But if you're thinking about size in terms of forest patch and forest land relative to forest land avian species or forest associated avian species, the larger blocks of forest you can actually maintain and manage and own, the better. Okay, that is always going to be the case when you're managing interior forest species birds. Um, Larger is also better because it gives you more options, more alternatives in terms of how do you perhaps want to manage your property. And also, if you're going to harvest, you've got more ability to harvest perhaps a section of your property and not impact the wildlife that's on the other parts of your property that is not getting harvested. The other thing you want to think about is that landscape context, and as we talked about already, is try to figure out where does your property fit into the larger regional landscape. And the easiest way to do that is go to Google Earth or some kind of an aerial satellite image of your property and see where your property fits in to that larger regional landscape. So find your property on the aerial map and then see what is around you. So are you the only forest land property within, let's say, 5 miles or so, something like that? Or are you perhaps a forest land property that may not be contiguous, but you've got forest land like blocks or islands of forest land around you, and perhaps you could use your forest land associated with the other blocks of forest land as kind of stepping stones to get wildlife across that landscape that might be not comfortable leaving the forest land or may not be terribly comfortable outside of forested landscapes. And so perhaps you could use your property as kind of a stepping stone. Um, the other option is, depending on how your property fits in that larger regional context, maybe you can start thinking about, well, how can we build out our property, or how can we maybe work with our neighboring landowners to more collectively and collaboratively manage our property so that we, instead of us having simply 20 acres, maybe if we're working with our neighboring landowners, maybe collectively we might be able to manage 200 acres or 500 acres, and then we can collectively decide how do we want to make management decisions. So that could be something that you might want to think about, that without looking at that aerial image, you may not have that context about how does my property fit into that larger regional landscape. And then finally is corridors. So this gets back to that stepping stone idea, or moving animals across a non-forested landscape. So if you look in the lower right-hand picture here, where you've got dots of forest land surrounded by some open areas, farmland and things like that. If you look in kind of the middle right-hand side of this right-hand picture, you'll see that corridor, that kind of hallway of forest land that's moving through that open grass or that open ag farmland right there. Well, that forest land hallway is a corridor, and so animals will actually utilize that corridor either by moving through inside the corridor or right alongside of it, where they can dive into cover if they need to. But those corridors can be really, really helpful, and it can be very helpful to move animals across the landscape if those animals are very mobile. But you may have some other animals like a wood turtle, for example, or some species that are not avian per se, that might live most of their, if not all of their life in those corridors, depending on the size of that corridor, how wide it is, the quality of the habitat in those corridors, things like that. So think about how does your property fit into that larger landscape, and then that can be very beneficial for not only managing your property, but managing your property for different types of wildlife. Okay, just to give you some other suggestions or some things to think about in terms of how you might manage your property, especially when it comes to harvesting your trees. So we're going to start with this middle green block of habitat right here. And let's say you've got a square block of habitat. Let's just say it's 100 acres, something like that. If you want to increase, or if you want to, as you start harvesting, if you want to maintain as much interior habitat as possible, you're going to leave as much of that block intact as you possibly can, and you might start harvesting on the outside of the block, but not through the middle of the block. Okay. If you're looking for less interior habitat, for example, an increasing edge, you, excuse me, you may cut that block up. And so you're not going to actually have a contiguous block, but you're going to have linear tracks that you're going to have in between. The yellow obviously is the forest land, the gray is the non-forested areas. So you're going to have non-forested areas in between those blocks of forest that you're actually harvesting. If you want to think about good connectivity, you can look down here in the lower right-hand picture, where maybe you're going to have these blocks of yellow forest land, but then you're going to create corridors or connected areas where animals can get from one block to the next using that forested hallway, so to speak. Compared to the left-hand corner here, where you don't have very good connectivity. You still have smaller blocks of habitat, but they're not very well connected. And when we get back to habitat, when we think about food, water, and shelter, you want food, water, and shelter to be clustered together and accessible. So, for example, in this lower left-hand picture here, where you've got poor connectivity, you don't want all the water to be in the circle and then all of the food to be in the upper right-hand yellow slice, and all of the shelter to be in the lower, or excuse me, in the left-hand yellow slice, because that's not accessible, where they don't have the birds or animals don't have accessibility to food, water, and shelter together. And so you want to be able to clump food, water, and shelter together versus spreading it out across the landscape. And so make sure you understand where the food, water, and shelter is on your property as you start thinking about maybe harvesting different parts of your property, or changing your property in some capacity. All right, as we start winding down here, a couple other things I want to share with you are just some things to think about in terms of what you might do on your forest property from the ground all the way up to the top. So, for example, we're going to focus on this yellow circle here And that's the understory area. So what is on the understory right there? If you look right here in this picture, and even if you look throughout, look through right here in the yellow circle and look throughout most of the picture here, that is a pretty clean understory. And a lot of people like clean forest floors, but that is not really beneficial for wildlife. And so, for example, in this yellow circle right here, there's very little detritus down. There's very little organic matter there that provides much cover. And so there's not a lot for animals, especially birds that are on the ground floor, forest floor. There's not a lot for them to kind of start picking through with their bills or their feet and looking for insects, for example, because there's just not a lot on that ground, on that forest floor. There's not a lot there in terms of structure for them to hide in. So if you're a bird in this yellow circle, you're going to be pretty easily seen by predators and other animals out there that as you're not going to feel very comfortable. Think about this from and Jamie's going to talk about more of this on Thursday with reptiles and amphibians. But if you're a redback salamander, for example, there just isn't a lot of cover there for you. And so you want to think about the messier your forest floor is, the better it is for wildlife. Thankfully, we don't have a lot of concern up here with wildfires. Obviously, if we were in the western part of the United States, we'd want to be a little bit more considerate about the amount of fuel that's on that forest floor. But up here in the temperate part of the United States, we don't have to be too concerned about wildfire. So you can leave fuel down on that forest floor, and that's really what you want to do. The messier your forest floor is, the better it is not only for birds, but for a vast majority of wildlife, because there's a lot of cover there, there's a lot of structure there, a lot of opportunity for them to find food, a lot of shelter for them to hide in, and things like that. So just think about what your forest floor looks like. The other thing to think about is the amount of dead trees or snags that you have on your property. And typically, it's recommended you have 3 to 5 snags per acre on your property. If somebody were to ask me what's the one thing, if you could only recommend one wildlife management practice, what would you recommend? And my answer would always be to either create or leave snags standing on your property. And again, 3 to 5 per acre if you can. Obviously, you want to be considerate about safety. So on your forest property, if you've got trails or you've got, you know that people are moving through there, you might want to be careful about where that snag is relative to if it falls, is it going to be safe for the people on the property? But to the extent you can, leave snags standing. And it's been documented that as many as 100 different species have used snags. So obviously, you have primary users such as all the woodpeckers. They'll get in there and they'll start opening up cavities in those snags. And then maybe a flying squirrel gets in that cavity, or perhaps a raccoon gets in there. Maybe a great horned owl will get in there and start to nest in there. And a lot of different other species will utilize that cavity, from mammals, reptiles, birds, insects, things like that. So snags are tremendously important to have on your property. And then the last thing is what we call CWD, and this is not chronic wasting disease. Excuse me. I'm not talking about chronic wasting disease relative to deer. It's coarse woody debris. And again, this gets back to how messy or how clean is your forest floor. But the more coarse woody debris you have down on the floor of not only logs, but different diameters, different amounts of decomposition going on, the healthier your forest floor is going to be relative to wildlife. So a log like this that is down, it's got a lot of bark that's starting to loosen. It's got a lot of moss on there, a lot of decomposing wood. And so you've got a lot of insects in there. Those insects are going to provide a tremendous amount of food sources for a variety of wildlife, birds included. You'll have a lot of things that will not only utilize the tops of the tree, but they'll be moving underneath those the trees and the other coarse woody debris, because it provides them some shelter, provides them food, and things like that. So again, coarse woody debris is really a very, very healthy thing to have on your forest floor. And the messier your forest floor is, the healthier it is for a wide variety of wildlife. Last thing I want to talk a little bit about is actually trails in your property. And one of the benefits of owning your property is to actually being able to access your property. And So if it's hard for you to move through your property, it's less likely that you're going to want to go onto your property. You're not going to actually hike through it. You're not going to monitor it, evaluate it, check up on it, things like that. So certainly you want to put trails in there, the trails can be rudimentary. They can just be, very small, narrow trails that only you can utilize, or maybe it's a deer trail that you want to expand a little bit just by using it. Perhaps it's a logging road that's been that the loggers cut in when they were harvesting your property, and then they reseeded that road. It really depends on what you want to use that property for. Do you want to use it for hiking? Do you want to be able to run ATVs and snowmobiles on it? That's going to dictate perhaps the size, width of your trails, things like that. The one thing I will suggest to you is, if you're going to build trails through the middle of your forest, to try to maintain as less disturbance, or the least amount of disturbance you possibly can. So it's one thing to have a trail through the middle of your forest, that where you haven't disturbed the canopy trees, but if you're actually cutting trees down to allow light to come in and to create that trail, well, now you're actually carving up the middle of your forest, or the interior part of your forest, and now you've got the ability for maybe non-native invasive species to come in. You are decreasing the amount of interior forest habitat. So to the extent you can, you probably want to keep your trails off to the edges or the outside of your forest. If you're going to intersect the interior forest, try to have those trails to be relatively narrow. Don't tear down any of the canopy trees that are there in order to build those trails. Instead, have the trails go around the tree versus take the tree down. If you're going to harvest, maybe work with your consulting forester or the DNR forester, and try to figure out how best can you get the logging machinery in there, and with the least amount of disturbance to the interior part of your forest. Okay, and then that can be very helpful to you and to the loggers, as well as to the wildlife. All right, and the last thing I'm going to share with you is, it is an incredible amount of fun to go out and bird your property. And this is an example of a Blackburnian warbler here. If you're not a birder, if you're not interested in birds yet, I would highly encourage you to go out and start learning your birds. Right now is a great time to do that when you really can't do much else in your property. It's too early to maple syrup, for example. There might be some logging, but probably not a lot of logging if you're harvesting right now. But learn your birds. There's some really good resources out there. You can get a great bird book like the Audubon book, or Peterson book, or something like that. But there are some wonderful apps that you can download to your phone or to your tablet. And my favorite is the Merlin app, Merlin. It's a free app that you can download. Not only does it identify birds by pictures, it talks to you or tells you the types of habitats they need, types of food they use. It's got songs on there and calls, so you can start learning the song and the call. It's one thing to see the bird, but as you know, in the summertime when you've got foliage on the trees and those birds at the top of the canopy, you can hear them, but it's really, really difficult to see them. So learning their songs can be very, very helpful as well. And again, as I mentioned, there's 400 bird species, give or take a couple, in the state of Wisconsin. So if you can learn all 400 bird species by sight and by sound, knock yourself out. But typically, what you might want to do is figure out the types of birds that are in your general area, and start to learn those birds, and maybe cut it down from 100 species to maybe 50 species, or excuse me, from 400 species to maybe 50 species or 100 species. And a couple ways to do that is to Google breeding bird survey, and then your part of the state. So maybe breeding bird survey and the county your forest land is in. And typically the breeding bird survey is a survey that's done during the breeding season. So during the spring and early summer. And it's a survey to inventory the amount of the types, and to some extent the amount of breeding birds that are in a particular area throughout the entire United States. So if you Google breeding bird survey and your county, you'll be able to cut down at least from 400 bird species to perhaps 50 bird species, to those birds that are within your county area where your forest land is located. And then go about start learning those birds, and then you can start adding on to your inventory, to your repertoire, maybe 10 species at a time, until you get all the way up to 400 bird species. So So those are some things to think about. Again, there's a lot more to consider in terms of forest land and managing your forest land for birds. Depending on the types of species you want to manage for, there might be some very species-specific management recommendations that are context-specific. So if you have some questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me via email or phone, and we can talk through those questions if you want to. But these are some general considerations that you might want to think about if you are interested in managing your forest land for birds.
That's great, David. Thanks. I had a general question about if someone has some openings on there within their woodland, they're small or big openings or bigger clear cuts. Is there
Yeah.
anything in specific they can do to enhance those to attract either open land birds or as they transition to woodland birds? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it totally depends on, again, how big your forest land is, where your forest land is relative to other forest lands. So if you're in the middle of the Schwalmka-Nicolay National Forest, for example, or a large state forest, and you've got some maybe a 10-acre open area, those open area birds, there some of them will get there, but it's going to be difficult for them to get there just because they are having to fly over habitat that they don't typically use, and they've got to find that 10-acre patch, amongst a 1,000-acre patch of forest land. So it really depends on where that is. But typically, the bigger the opening, the more useful it would be to the opening of those birds. And if you can get those openings more on the outside of your forest land, so that perhaps it's closer to other openings, be it grassland, ag land, maybe suburban, land, something like that. That probably is going to be more useful than if you've got your opening in the middle of a 1,000-acre forest, and there are very few, if no other openings around there. But the openings can be really beneficial. Again, especially if you're clear cutting, that's a great way to open your property up, and you get a lot of openings in there. Those openings, especially after you clear cut and you start getting some growth back in there with the grasses and shrubland, that can be really, really productive in terms of creating a tremendous amount of wildlife diversity.
Now, you mentioned that insects are a really important food source, especially during nesting season. Is there any best management practices you should undertake to promote or preserve that food source for those nesting birds?
Yeah, I think again, it probably depends on what you're doing in your property, but if you are conducting some kind of a large scale spraying operation, for example, where you're trying to control, I don't know, spongy moth or something like that, just the type of insecticide you're using, try to find that insecticide that's going to be the least harmful to the greatest classification of insects. If you are using insecticides, herbicides, try to use them strategically and very directed application versus more of a broad application. If you've got water in your property, that will be really beneficial to attracting insects and promoting insects. If you have dead, decaying trees, that's really wonderful to actually bring insects into your property. So, any of those types of applications should be insect beneficial.
I've also heard about when to mow your trails, and I've heard after July 4th. Is 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 that the number you should think about, or is there a better gauge you should use to when to mow so you don't disturb either habitat or nesting birds?
Yeah, so typically it's usually July 15th is what's given to people who might be mowing hay for the first time. And so try to mow after July 15th, because typically then the birds that are nesting in those areas will at least get one clutch off before the habitat is mowed down. So that's something you might want to think about. If you are mowing trails and things like that as well, you may want to wait until I think I think the recommendation is to not disturb those trails, or in terms of mowing them, raking them, anything like that, until you've had at least 5 consecutive days of 50-degree weather or better, because that allows those insects to actually start waking up, and waking up from hibernation, and they have the ability to get out of that weedy or grassy vegetation and move on someplace else. So you're not actually killing the insects as well. So probably don't mow until, well, down here in the southern part of the state, we talk about no mow May. But maybe don't mow until the first week in June or something like that from an insect standpoint. and probably don't mow until July 15th from a bird nesting standpoint.
I love you talk about the messy floor in the forest. That's a tough one for a lot of people because
It
especially if
is.
they're yeah, if you're burning wood, any stick you leave out there is one less that's going to keep your house warm.
I
Um,
know. I know. It is. It's like I think we all as human beings, we've got a gene in us that, it's Tuesday, we have to mow the lawn whether it needs it or not, or it's, we've got a stick on the forest floor, we've got to pick that up because it is, we're just conditioned that a clean forest floor, it just aesthetically it looks better. But it's contrary, a messy forest floor is actually better for forest health and for wildlife health.
when it comes to conifers on the property, is there any guidelines about bunching them together if you're planting or leaving bunch them together or scattered better? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, Bill, maybe if you have some opinions about that too, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this as well. But I think it really comes down to, what there's I guess a few considerations. What are your goals for your forest property? I mean, if your goal is to have a plantation or something like that where you want to plant a lot of different trees in order to harvest that, if your goal is economics in your property, or one of your goals is economics where you want to harvest your property, you probably want to plant a big chunk of your property to something that's a harvestable species, be it pine or oak or whatever the case might be. But if you're not concerned about that, then clustering trees for sure. And I think, 10 pines together is better than one pine together. 100 pines together is probably better than 10 pines together. So I think it all depends on what type of space you have available to plant, what the goals are for your property, and then what are you trying to manage for in terms of both forest land and for wildlife. But Bill, do you have any suggestions for that too?
I think you hit what I was going to say, and you hit it kind of hit on the head was what are the goals for your property? And if your goal is for wildlife habitat, I think that the more diversity in that kind of structure you have, the better,
Yeah.
whether it's clumped or spread apart
Yep.
and species diversity too. I think those are the keys for all of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have a favorite conifer that you prefer to see
Oh,
planted versus others for bird habitat?
oh, I don't know. I mean, the conifers are not tremendously wonderful for wildlife generally. I mean, if you look like a red oak or a white oak, just the amount of mass that the oaks put down, and from a food source, those hardwoods are probably better than a conifer. The real benefit of conifers is because they provide tremendous shelter, especially in the wintertime, because they don't lose their leaves. I mean, you've got, if you think about a spruce, for example, you've got like crossbills is a type of bird where their bills are crossed, and they use that cross bill to kind of pry open the seed inside that pine cone. Squirrels will use pine cones, for example. But for the most part, those cones are, not a tremendous amount of wildlife doesn't use those cones for food. So I think if you had, like, as you mentioned, Bill, if you were interested in diversity, if you could provide some hardwoods for the mast, and then you could provide some evergreens for the shelter, I think you would have a pretty nice mix of both food and shelter availability there.
And we've got a question about prickly ash, and it made me think, is there a species of a plant or shrub or tree that's not really loved by foresters or people who are managing trees, but for wildlife, they're like an amazing species to have on your property? Is there something like that when that comes to mind?
Yeah, I don't know about not loved. I mean, I think, I tend to always go toward native species. So, chokecherry, any of
Mm.
the viburnum species is tremendously helpful. I think ash is really good. I saw somebody had a question about emerald ash borer. Ash is a wonderful thing to have on the property because it is a late winter fruiting plant, and it provides a lot of food sources for those early returning migratory birds. But it right now with emerald ash borer, it probably isn't the best thing to plant. But holly is a good one. Again, chokecherry, black cherry, sumac, that kind of stuff where you've got some kind of a food source. And typically in the wintertime, I mean, birds don't really need a tremendous amount of help year round, but when they do need help from a food standpoint, it's late winter, early spring, before the growing season has started again. And by late winter, the animals that are here year round and have been here all winter long, they're starting to exhaust those native and natural food supplies. So anything you can put on your property, if you have to really start choosing about when do you want to provide food, anything you can put on your property that would be providing food from a forest species standpoint, late winter, early spring would be tremendously beneficial to birds as well as a lot of other types of wildlife.
And what's a short list that would hit that time frame for food
I think
supply?
again, like those hollies, ashes, choke cherries, the viburnum species would be good. Sumac, birch, with the catkins, all that would be good.
Because they're both they have food that's still on their tree
Yeah,
all
yep,
winter, and
yep,
they're starting to put out early catkins and stuff for
yeah,
the spring
yep,
growth. Okay.
yep. So it's more of a food issue than it is a shelter issue.
Okay. I was wondering
Yep.
if that's an exhaustion of the understory, or if the stuff that's already in the trees is still kind of hanging on and still providing a food source.
Yeah, I think it probably depends on how many species are around there and how how many animals you're attracting.
Okay. I think we've covered the questions. There's one that I'll respond to separately, but I want to
Okay.
thank you for your time, David. That's a great
Yeah.
presentation, and I'll give folks in you're in from contact information if they got tons of
Okay.
questions that they want to answer, specific questions about their property. I'll send them your way.
Yeah, please. That'd be great.
Okay, thanks
That'd be great.
everyone for participating. And as David said on Thursday, his colleague Jamie is going to talk about reptiles and amphibians. So we'll see you then.
Bill, thanks so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Dave.
Yep. Have a good rest of your day.